All right, thank you so much, everyone who was able to participate in that session. We did a little breakout for those joining us nationally right now. We're really excited now to be participating in this national conversation together. My name is George Benson. I'm the Senior Manager of Economic Transformation at the Vancouver Economic Commission. We are the City of Vancouver's economic development agency. And I'm really privileged to be here with all of you on the unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam. We had a wonderful welcome from the Coast Wolf group this morning who gave us a beautiful dance and welcome to kick us off. So my hands again to them for that wonderful introduction and welcome to this space. For those who don't know, this session is part of the Together Ensemble 2023 conference, which is Canada's national gathering on the Sustainable Development Goals. The conference runs from June 7th to 9th in person at 5 sites across the country and brings together Canada's SDG community to understand what's going on and how we can work together more effectively. We're grateful again to be holding this on Musqueam territory here at UBC as part of this national gathering, and we're really excited to welcome our colleagues from across the country to this conversation. You'll be able to participate digitally, which we're really thrilled to have, while the rest of us are here in Vancouver chatting amongst ourselves. So I'm going to skip these slides because we already did this. We already did our breakout here, and we've had a little short report back. So as I said, I'm George Benson, manager at the Vancouver and resilient local economy that's competitively positioned in the global market, and I'll talk a little bit about how that The just transition, I think, like many things, like decolonization and UNDRIP, for example, is cross-cutting. It does not adhere to a single SDG, but I think these 5 are indicative of some of the relationships that are held across different SDGs we probably know well. So let's start at the very beginning of this. And I think this premise is really what brings myself and my team to this work. And that is that job losses, as this wonderful quote from Annabella Rosenberg says, job losses are not an automatic consequence of climate policies. Rather, they are the result of the lack of investment, of social policies, and I think really crucially, of anticipation. And I'm an urban planner, so I think of anticipation, I think of plans. And as I was saying in the breakout before we got started, there's a great quote from Brian Kohler from 1996 that the real choice is not jobs or the environment, it is both or neither. And I think that's the state that we find ourselves in. I want to start by telling a story about a guy named Peter here. Peter is 40, he's a father of 2, he's the main provider in a family that relies on an automotive factory. That automotive factory where he's employed is really struggling because of both increased pressures of automation and digitalization, as well as climate policy. And as a result of that, those challenges, the car manufacturing plant is struggling and a lot of workers are laid off, including Peter. Some people from the factory are able to find office jobs. Some are able to move outside of town and find other jobs further away, and some never find new work again. And the people that experience those different pathways experience different challenges that come with them. The workers that go out of town have longer commutes, they may have pay cuts, they have losses of seniority, and other challenges. Those who don't find work at all, of course, face not only the loss of income, but all of the myriad social complexities that come with that. But it doesn't stop there. For the community that Peter's located in, the city budget, because of this economic dislocation, starts to decline. There's reduced tax revenue, there's fewer volunteers, there's fewer tourists, there's business closures. In the worst case, we could be looking at an economic death spiral for a community. This is a really core, this is the story I think that many of us are familiar with, and this is why people have been talking about and fighting for a just transition for quite a long time. So the first mention of the just transition is in the 1970s. There was a mention earlier in our breakout about the labor origination of that. Tony Mazzocchi, who was a US labor leader, coined the term. I think it really came to BC in the 90s during the so-called War in the Woods in Clayoquot Sound. May Burrows, who was the former president of the Vancouver District Labor Council, was a real leader in saying we need to bring labor and environmental groups together, 2 groups that are trying to do the right thing but are being put at loggerheads, quite literally in this case, because of the way our economic system is set up. And so May and many, many others did incredible work to push forward, I think, what we would today call concepts related to a just transition. In 2015, the ILO adopted the term just transition and said this has to be a really core part of the work to move forward on climate action globally. And then Metro Vancouver's Climate Action and Just Transition Roundtable in 2018 sort of further cemented this concept in our region More articulately, in 2021, VEC produced a best practices report to understand how we as an economic development agency could take on work here. And then in 2022, most recently, we were really privileged to hold a session with a number of BIPOC sustainability practitioners and understanding for those communities in particular, how might a just transition show up for them and how might we take action with them to achieve those ends. So let's talk about what a just transition might mean so that the story of Peter we just heard doesn't happen the way that it did. VEC worked for about a year with a number of labor colleagues, community groups, Indigenous organizations, and others to try to understand what a just transition would look like. And just because I'm short of time, I'm not going to read this in its entirety, but I think the operative word here that we've really tried to center is that it's a worker-centered approach to ensuring that people, in effect, end up better off materially, healthfully, socially on the other side of this transition to net zero than they were when they started. And that's a really core underpinning of how we believe this work takes shape. And the work is important because there's so many things driving it. We have a variety of climate policies across the region here. We have Clean BC, we have the various federal climate plans, we have the city's climate emergency action plan, and. There are a huge number of drivers for this work, and we're trying to serve a regional workforce that's very complicated amidst all of these different policy drivers. And the policy drivers specifically are hitting our largest source of emissions, gas in vehicles in the transportation sector, and the use of gas primarily in buildings. Those are like really core industrial sectors that employ huge numbers of people and are going to be the thin edge of the wedge when it comes to, we don't think there'll be that many job losses in Vancouver, but transitions, disruptions, there's going to be a lot in those sectors. The Climate Emergency Action Plan in Vancouver, that Vancouver passed in 2021, directed VEC to work on the just transition. They said, you're the economic developers, figure it out, talk to the right people, see what you can understand what needs to be done. And as part of that, we produced what we call the Zero Emissions Economic Transition Action Plan, or ZTAP, and I'll refer back to that in the panel here, where ZTAP is our that's our plan as an agency for how we can tackle not only the just transition issue area, but a variety of other topics related to zero emissions and the new economy. We did a wonderful best practices research report that was written by my colleague Vanessa Sun, who's on my team and was a UBC Masters of Planning student at the time. And out of that work, we developed this concept of a just transition coalition. The name of that, I think, is still being debated. We have, we do like to debate our terms. But the structure you can see here is really trying to reach into a multi-layered, multi-stakeholder, multi-perspective view of this very complicated regional workforce. We need Indigenous groups there. We need local government there. We need labor unions. We need business groups. We need community groups. There's so many people at the table, and the myriad government agencies and nonprofits that are all trying to serve them. It's a very big table, and we need a lot of those people there. And so over the past year and a half, we've been looking to put those folks at said table. Again, we're short on time, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but we've had a number of really interesting highlights over the years in the just transition work. I think I'm really proud of the work we've been able to do with BIPOC communities, really trying to support them and ensure that the green economies workforce doesn't just look folks like me. And that's really core to our values. We've had a lot of challenges and learnings here. It's really hard to engage everyone because there are lots of people and very different groups that we need to speak with. There's so many things we can do and need to do as part of a just transition. It can be that perfect being the enemy of the good is often a challenge where it's like, oh, okay, how do we get this started? And then there are a lot of metrics and measurements and ways we can understand our impact. And some of those are going to tell one part of the story and others are going to tell a different one. We need to amalgamate those, whether that's through two-eyed seeing or other concepts, to ensure we really capture the full breadth of what people need and what people are doing. But we've also learned a lot of positive lessons, I think, in this too. One of the really core ones is not about just any job is a good job, anything we can get people, right? We don't think it's fair that people who are making good wages now all of a sudden are down to minimum wage at the end of a transition. That's not just. And the people who have been historically excluded from the labor market, we don't want them to get that minimum wage job either. We want there to be equity and fairness on the other side of this for everyone. The just transition is a lengthy process. I've already hit this there's two workers, those who need to be reskilled, those who need those challenges to be addressed. And as we mentioned, there's lots of disagreements over the terminology, but I think optimistically, there is a ton of agreement when we sort of put down our barriers a little bit and say, but what are we hoping to get to on the other side? Like, what do the conditions of success look like? We generally find those look pretty similar. And where there are disagreements, well, that's why we need to have these bodies and groups to discuss them so that we don't just sit on that and then at the last minute, it's like, oh, we can't do that. That's going to get us where we want to go. So if we go back to Peter here, and we can have an intervention that's going to serve not only him, but his family and his community's needs, the work of retraining, of upskilling can mean that not only Peter, but anyone who faces these kind of challenges can be a genuine participant in the net zero economy that we are all working so directly towards. So that's a really quick flyby of the just transition from our perspective at VEC. I'm going to turn now to our fabulous panelists here, who are really, really smart people who are going to talk to you for the next little bit about what this means to them. You know me, so I'm not going to mention myself. We're doing this on Slido, so especially for those across the country who are watching, really encourage you to use this number, and I'll flash it back up. But slido.com, and the code you can enter is 1077459, and that'll enable you to ask questions that I'll pull up while we're having the conversation here. So we have 4 fabulous panelists who we've been really privileged to do work on this issue area with over the course of the past few years, actually. We have Janet Andrews, who's the Secretary Treasurer at the New Westminster District Labour Council. We have Nathan Grandjean, who's our Senior Manager of Indigenous Economic Prosperity, and one of my dear colleagues at the VEC. We have Tessa Jordan, who's the Program Head for Sustainable Business Leadership at BCIT. And we have Max Cohen, who's a PhD candidate in geography here at UBC, who specializes in the just transition. I'd ask you to give them all a quick hand as we get into the panel. Okay, so what we're going to do is we've got 3 questions for the panelists here. I'll ask them to go through quickly, and then we'll start to break this open to everyone. So I'm going to start with Max here, actually, which is, I think, a broad question to get us started. How do you envision a just transition in general and specific to the kind of work and spaces that you spend time in?
So I'll just say a bit about my research. So my research focuses on just Scotland and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Both countries established just transition commissions in 2019. Both places have fossil fuel dependent regions, so in the Shetland Islands and Aberdeen, the north of Scotland, and Taranaki, the region in New Zealand. And both places are very windy, and so they're developing wind turbines on top of the oil infrastructure. And so I'm interviewing people involved in the commission and local communities and workers involved in those processes. Something of just anecdotally is I'm interested in this word transition as well, and something that's quite applicable to Canada is that some people say that we should be discussing energy additions rather than energy transitions, is because actually the history of energy transitions going back to the 19th century from biomass to coal didn't see the complete removal of biomass and wood, and then the transition from coal to oil didn't see the complete removal of coal. Actually, we've just seen the kind of ramping up of more energy, accumulation of more energy, and just additions on additions on additions. And similarly, that's kind of what's happening now, is the building of renewables on top of fossil fuel infrastructure, and general kind of ramping up of energy additions. So I'm quite interested in that tension. Yeah, that's all I'll say for now.
Well, thank you. I want to turn to Nathan here. How do you think about a just transition and this, specific to your mandate?
Thank you. Realistically, when it comes to my own intersectionality with the just transition, there's a fair bit of nuance to it, because as an Indigenous person who comes from a remote community with traditional territory over the oil sands, there's a lot of conflicting drives within myself, and a lot of consideration has gone into my ever-evolving perspective on what a just transition might mean to myself. Recently, actually, no, I'll go back a little bit. My people settled a land claim in the 80s under Treaty 8, and we took a fair bit of capital in lieu of land. We actually gave up some of our land claim to be able to get some economic enfranchisement, and we used that to create economic opportunities for ourselves. And given the situated location near the oil sands, we went into the oil and gas industry, looking to supplement and find opportunities there. And so now this has been a major driver for our nation's ability to be socially, economically mobile. It's been a big part of how many of us have been able to get education and work experience within our own nation, which is absolutely huge for a remote community. And I really love Max's point there about adding energy, in that we've just recently finished a 1.5 megawatt solar plant up there to reduce our dependence on diesel generators to produce electricity, which has fostered our own energy sovereignty in a really big way, and kind of is, in a small part, kind of a symbolic sign of how this might come about in some of these communities. Granted, we did it by our own gumption and good fortune and having the tools to do that. Not every nation has that. And so it's important to look for those intersections that are left out by these opportunities, and how can we lift up more people than just those that have the capacity to lift themselves. So those are something I really think about a lot with the just transition.
That's sort of, if I'm hearing you right, like the historical context of colonization, and now this sort of look ahead to, okay, we're in an energy transition or addition as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that captures it pretty well. Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan. I want to turn to Janet now. Janet, you're in organized labor. What does the just transition mean to you?
Well, it's a bit of a fraught word for us, actually. It's had, I think there was some early missteps, unfortunately. And so, I think it's best for us not to get too hung up on the terminology. So we'll use this as a kind of a convenience to talk, but to understand that, a just transition is not taking someone from the oil sands and retraining them to work in like healthcare, for example. We're looking at completely different skill sets, completely different mindsets. And so we have to be looking at the transition as worker-centered. I think there's sort of three things for us in labor that are critical to achieving a just transition. One, that it centers workers' voices. And when we say that, we mean particularly traditionally and historically marginalized voices. So that's workers of color, that's Indigenous workers, that's workers with accessibility challenges to the current workforce. And so centering those voices, listening to them, and not acting without that consultation. And we take that sort of from the disability rights advocacy, that nothing about us without us. I think that's really critical when we're talking about this. If we want the transition to be workable and to have folks on board, we have to be at the table. The second piece that comes out of that as well is equity. I think the biggest barrier to just transition is inequality. Globally, locally, and within Canada, and to just make sure that at every step it's equitable, right? And again, that's centering those voices that will tell us where the inequities are and being really deliberate about that. And then the last piece for us is that it be evidence-based. No guessing. We really need to take a look at what expertise, and that includes Indigenous knowledge as well, not just sort of academic knowledge, but looking at knowledge as a broad base. How do we bring that all together? So thank you.
As a social scientist, or trained as a social scientist, love me some qualitative expertise to be brought in there. Nathan, I wonder if I can turn to you here for this second question first, which is, and this is really key because I think we've hit on this a few times. If we do have a fairly rigid understanding of the just transition, VC has used the terminology of worker-centric, others may not. But at the end of the day, these terms have to have limits, right? Like they can't go on endlessly. It can't be, the just transition means save the world. I mean, I think it's part of saving the world, but I don't know that it's on its own. So to you, Nathan, what can a just transition accomplish, and what else needs to be brought in? What are the other concepts, what are the other forces that need to be in play if we're going to get to the kind of world that you're envisioning?
Wow, grandiose question. I'm not a fan of being the first one on this, but I'll do my best to do it justice. So in terms of what it can accomplish, I think in a small form, we could actually see workforce development done in a way that centers equity, in a way that centers intersectionality, and appreciating that we all come to every development, every growth opportunity, every transition from different places. There's no ubiquity to opportunity within this capitalistic system. So within this paradigm, within the just transition, how might we find ways to facilitate equitable pathways to success for everybody? I think that's something that just transition can accomplish, and that's something that resonates quite a bit with myself. I'm sorry, I missed the back half of that question there.
Well, I think not to lead you, but I'm thinking a little bit of, does the just transition on its own, for example, can it recognize, can it achieve Indigenous sovereignty, or is the just transition a component or allied to that other work of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty?
Yeah, I think there's pathways to that. There's definitely elements that we could see in situ that could encapsulate that. To speak to my own nation's experience, definitely the transition to renewable energy fosters our own energy sovereignty, our own national sovereignty, our own ability to exist outside of the dependence upon international markets and to be self-sustainable, return more to our traditional ways without having to upkeep systems that were imposed on us. So there's definitely tremendous value and potential within the just transition, but as I kind of alluded to earlier, the key is trying to find ways to enfranchise those who don't already have most of the pieces in place for that.
Oh, thank you. I just want to open it up. Does anyone else want to jump into that? What can it do, and what else do we need?
Can I just jump in? Yeah, I just, as an anecdote, we wrote just on the importance of terminology. Is like I wanted to adopt a kind of more expansive definition of just transition beyond workers to communities affected as well. And so we wrote this paper with the Centre for Climate Justice at UBC and Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And it was about a community transition approach in Canada. And we framed it as a just transition. But then our funders for the paper were a union, and they were not happy with how we used the term just transition as expansive beyond workers, specifically because a lot of unions are engaged in dialogue with the federal government about trying to negotiate terms that they can win gains for workers. And by expanding the definition, you risk diluting it. And so I, from that time, have been sort of a bit more careful with how I use the term just transition. But I think it's an interesting, there's a kind of danger of transition washing as well, of like it becoming sort of applicable to different. So Shell talk about just transition as well as BC government. So you have to be quite, careful with how we talk about it. But it's an interesting term because it just means that kind of fair process of change, which we all, I think, would agree with. But yeah.
I feel like if we're going to talk about transition washing, the person representing business should maybe jump in here. So I chair a sustainable business program at BCIT, and we also provide industry training as well. So I work directly with folks often who have a lot of power, and I also work with students who are wanting to get into these careers and go in and change organizations from the inside. On our panel this morning, there was the question around, can we work inside of existing systems? That's my personal theory of change. So I used to work outside the systems. Now I've come inside. And I think what I've learned is that there's a lot of intentional and unintentional of these, whether it's transition washing, social washing, greenwashing, and that most people show up to do good work. And so for me, working on just transition work with organizations that often have a lot of capital, I ask, so what brings you? You've never had a conversation about sustainability or environmental social governance before. Why now? Why are you showing up, right? And people say things like, the number one answer we get is, I want to be able to look my kids in the eye and say I did something. That's the number one answer we get. The next is, we're not taking good enough care of our employees. And I work with small and medium-sized enterprises. I also work with really large companies as well. And we don't know how to redress the harm we've done. We don't know. And so we talk a lot in our training about comfort with uncertainty. A lot about comfort with uncertainty. Business wants to come for a 5-point plan, right? 5-point plan, how are we gonna do this? Let's pick some SDGs and get it done, get it across the finish line. I mean, what's been amazing to see is people starting to show up with more humility and saying, this isn't working. Right? Who was it this morning who said, more people are recognizing this isn't working? And when it's not working, how can we build better together? And so without co-opting the phrase, nothing about us without us, when we think about business that takes care of all stakeholders, including nature and future generations, all stakeholders, including nature and future generations, how do people have meaningful seats at the table? Meaningful seats at the table that allow for accountability. And so I say that I work at the intersection of personal development and systems change, because I don't necessarily think right now we have the human skills always to have conflict and conversation about conflict and difference without being so triggered that we can't still share a table. And so I think there's George referenced head and heart. You and I talk about that a lot. But I think when we think about this transition washing that could, to bring it back to Max's comments, that could happen, as we get more and more folks showing up to the table, how can we help with some of those human skills to have the difficult conversations and the inclusive, bringing everyone around, creating a bigger table, right? Creating a bigger table.
Okay, if I could just put one thought in there, which is to say that I think in some ways, not always, I want to be very clear, not always, but in some ways, we should look to these washing moments as actually a sign of progress, because it means people know they have to use those terms. They have to be pointing to that thing. Even if they are, I do think some people are insincere when they use those terms, but I think a lot of them are just genuinely trying to figure it out. They come from a particular positionality and they're trying to do their best of it. And so when we encounter those, like, we do need to hold those people accountable, as someone said earlier, but also to see that as a success of the movement, that terms are now being in use, that you can't enter into a conversation without having some of that vernacular in play. But sorry, Janet, I cut you off there.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on 2 points. I think from a worker's perspective, the templates are there for working together when we look at workplace health and safety, for example. The responsibility for workplace health and safety lies both on the employer and the worker. We come to that table together, we discuss, right? And in its best versions, both are responsible, both are accountable, and the workplace is safer. And everybody goes home at the end of the day. That's our goal. So I think the templates are there. It's just expanding our vision to apply some of those current templates and not just related to workplace health and safety. And I think just to speak to Max's point, some of the hesitancy we would have around expanding definitions is kind of that experience of creating those gaps where people will try and get around through, right? When there's a gap created. And so that's where some of the hesitancy will arise around expanding, broadening the definitions, because we understand as workers, the just transition for us as workers impacts our community. It's the taxes that we pay as workers that fund the services, that fund supports for different sectors of our community. So we do understand it as a whole piece, but I think the hesitancy will arise around those little gaps into which people will look to escape accountability and responsibility.
You probably don't often hear an economic developer say this, but I'm a really big fan of rules, because rules create transparency. And transparency, if you believe in the free market, which is, we all know is not a real thing, but if you believe in markets, as in like the competitive exchange of goods and services, markets require transparency. Markets require fairness to function effectively. That's why we have antitrust laws. It's not fair to have one big company in charge of everything. And we've tried that, and it's really bad. We may be trying it again right now, and that's also probably really bad. But I think there's a lot of reasons why, from even a very traditional market-based outlook, those principles apply. I want to go to just one last question, and again, I'll just throw it to you all, whoever wants to jump in on here, before we turn to the audience, is where do we get started here? You know, there's lots of things that we could do. Many of them are already underway. But if you had, either something you are doing or your organization's doing, or something you're like, that's next, that's what I want to see take shape, I'd love to turn it to you all. How are we going to get this just transition moving here in Vancouver?
I'll start. I think there's a great example going on right now with the Broadway extension. And what we look at in the labor movement, one of these great examples of how we can work forward are project labor agreements or community benefit agreements. And so we're building, using public dollars, tax dollars, to build public infrastructure that will facilitate movement around the region, that will reduce climate impacts from everybody in their own cars. And so there's all these good things. And then there's the requirements on these projects for hiring Indigenous folks, hiring women, hiring workers of color specifically, and then taking these folks that come as new apprentices through to what we call completion of their trades. And so they come out of a project that may be over several years, doing their apprenticeship on this single project and coming out as a fully qualified journey person or tradesperson to move on and do other work. And so that public investment pays benefits, community benefits, right? And not just to that worker. And so those supports, and I think to me, the specifics around making sure that it's Indigenous apprentices, workers. The BC Centre for Women in Trades does amazing work as well. Give them a shout out. And young workers, and just making sure. So that for me is a current example and really a template for how we could do some of this.
Well, the good news is, I don't know if folks know, but we need to build a lot of stuff to deal with climate change. So there's lots of projects coming our way. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, just on that, I think just in terms of research, I think there could be quite interesting research done across the socials. I'm in geography, kind of human geography, social sciences with a background in politics. So I think the kind of social sciences in UBC could do quite interesting research on looking at that shift to the green economy from the fossil fuel economy. It sort of obscures the really intensely material nature of the green economy, how much critical mining is going to go into it, the vast electrification which is taken across BC at the moment, and just who funds this hall is BC Hydro. I think someone could do a really good research project on an institutional analysis of BC Hydro and how to democratise it. And institutions who are sort of deciding the future of the green economy and what that looks like. There's some really interesting research that could be done there.
Energy democracy. Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that really stands out for me is how easy it can be when people are new to this work to flip from head in the sand to despair. So lots of the organizations and individuals that I work with go, oh, I don't know how I didn't know, but I didn't know. And now I'm just going to flip to despair. And so I'm trying to help people stay in that uncomfortable space. And we think a lot about with great privilege comes great responsibility. And that there hasn't been that sense of reciprocity in our relations, in our economic systems. With great privilege comes great responsibility. And so someone, I don't remember your name, in our group talked about there's all these wonderful individual actions that you can do, obviously. But the biggest action you can do is likely in your workplace, right? So if you have any power or privilege in your workplace, that changing inside of that workplace is where you can have a really big impact. So thank you for that. And when we think about changing systems, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, some of you might be familiar with her book, All We Can Save. And her new book is going to be called What If We Get This Right? What if we get this right? So she did an amazing talk recently where she talked about we run towards what we love. We run towards what we love. And right now we're kind of asking people to run towards a bit of a black box. So I actually spend a lot of time with folks envisioning, what if we get this right? So people come, they got their time objections, their money objections. It's too expensive. It's going to take too much time, whatever. I'm already doing these 2,700 other things. And I think the time and money objections to the just transition are a red herring. I think if we really motivate people to run towards what we love and it looks possible, I have seen some of the most reticent individuals sell their company back to their workers. So go from a private-owned enterprise to sell their company back to their workers. And that was a very resident individual, I can tell you, in the beginning. And so I don't know if I answered your question, George, but I'm obsessed with repeating this idea from my Aunt Elizabeth Johnson that we run towards what we love. And so whatever you can do to not put the individual burden on you, of course, make your good individual choices, but inside the systems in which you work, and help people envision what are we running towards.
Yeah, I guess I'll chip in there and carrying on the theme of relations. I take that back to some traditional teachings that I reflect on often. In Nehiyawewen, we have an expression, "Kotuwen," which means many things, but if I tried to make it literal, it would be the process of kinship, the process of relationships. It's an ever-living, it's a verb-based language, so it centers it as a thing we actively pursue in each moment. And philosophically, it talks about how all things are related, all things are connected. So when I think about the things that are important to me, how is that reflected in my relationships? How is that reflected in how I carry myself in the world? If this is important to me, Am I talking about it at work? Am I talking about it with my peers? Am I talking about it with my friends and family? Is it on my socials? What does that look like? And so when I really think about what works best in this space, is this dialogue. It's infusing our relationships with things that are important to us. And just transition as a paradigm is important to me. So I want to talk about that with people. I want them to have a chance to reflect upon it and to reflect to me in a way that will expand my own understanding of it. Building relationships, building networks where people come together and share and express, that to me is the path forward, and that's where I think the work that we've done within the VEC about the Just Transition Working Group is what I would point to, creating opportunities for people to come together and talk about this critical issue and come out better for it, hopefully, knock on wood.
So you're saying we should do this work together?
Absolutely.
So, any final thoughts? Okay, let's turn to you folks. Yes, I've got one right here.
I'm struck by the different disciplines that you've all studied and that you all work in. And I look at you and I wonder what examples of interdisciplinary collaboration you've seen in your careers and what strategies you use to work across disciplines, because it is very easy to get stuck in them.
Sure, I'll lead in there. So a lot of my most recent work background comes from wealth management, so investment advising, financial planning. Please don't hold it against me. But by and large, reframing the narrative of what value is. What is a successful portfolio? What's a good investment? What's a good return? It's more than just a fiscal remonstration or reimbursement, right? So you're trying to expand those notions of wealth, re-expand those notions of what it is to succeed financially is something that has been a part of my path in that, and which takes me into economic development, which is a lot of soft skills, a lot of people skills, and learning to change these narratives of what we're trying to achieve in a financial space. That's, to me, focusing on the people has been the key narrative driver there. And where I found the most success.
Yeah, I mean, redefining value to be what we actually value, to be what we actually care about. And so I would say for me, interdisciplinarity has been a theme throughout both my academic background, my current work, and I'm really passionate about it. And I would say show up with more questions than answers. Because sometimes you can use language that will turn people off from coming to your table. And if you're going to, different disciplines think about things in different ways, different organizations think about things in different ways. So one of these micro-credential that I'm running right now, we work really hard to have people in the room who are from every level of organizations, from senior leaders all the way down to frontline workers. And almost every sector of the BC economy will be represented amongst a cohort of about 20 people. And so for us, it's really important that we're learning from the wisdom in the room. So getting diverse people in the room and then showing up with more questions than answers, and falling in love with your problem rather than your solution. Those are my 3 things for working across disciplinary difference, because we often have problems in common, but our solutions can be quite different. And we could build another thing together that would actually meet everyone's needs. Interest-based conflict resolution is like my current obsession in these conversations. And so I do believe that we can do that if we show up with more questions than answers.
Yeah, for me, I think, and jumping off of that, it's active listening. So it's not forming your responses while you're listening, while you should be listening to someone else. And I think that's how we do that deep hearing. And you get to understanding by doing that listening. For me, I think, they say, oh, a labor leader, and you spend all your time, on the picket line, which I was on yesterday, but, justice for workers. But it's really intersectional with community. And so a lot of the work I do at the Labour Council, which is a central labour body where lots of unions gather together, and we have within the House of Labour, competing interests. We have different sectors, public sector, private sector, different work being done, but we can all agree and work together and stand in solidarity, and that's a really important concept for us. Is to stand together and also stand together with community. And so we do that work with allies in community and the nonprofit sector. And so we're always hearing different things, by actively listening when we're engaging with folks, and not just allies, but to listen to everyone. And you can take something from every conversation, even if it's not comfortable, or even if you don't agree with it. It's that active listening.
Yeah, just interdisciplinarity is really important. So I like the idea of sticking with the problem. I'm doing geography, but I spend most of my time reading engineers and economics and energy, like really dense stuff that I get quite geeky about. But I think it's really important to stick with to challenge yourself with the disciplines that speak a different language and try to translate that into different.
What do you mean? Financial jargon is so clear. I mean,
We're getting close to the end, so what I want to suggest is let's take a few questions. Quick, if you can try to be succinct, because I'd like to try to get these folks to pinball through a few of this. So I see, can I just get the hands again? So I got one. Okay, we got lots. Okay. Andrea, can I skip you? You've got so many good ideas.
Well, I'm happy to step.
Okay. I'll do you. I've got you over there. Did I have one more over here? Let's try those three. You want to start?
So the one question I have, we talked a lot about intersectionality, interconnection, interdisciplinary. Where do you see systemic trauma, intergenerational trauma, all these different forms of trauma and the effect it has on the brain, our ability to do our jobs? How do you see that conversation being incorporated into a just transition? Because it has a huge effect, and trying to separate the two it's ridiculous. So I think my question is about that in terms of all of the different fields. What do you see?
How to make the just transition trauma informed.
Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, was it you? Yeah, I think. Did you have a hand up? Oh, sorry.
Hi, Janet, you made me think about the inequity question. And that goes back to George having said we can't save the world, we need to do something. It's not necessarily saving the world, but our resources are finite. The planet's resources are finite. And we're looking at local solutions economically, et cetera, that are not in balance with the capacity of the world. If we look at other labor movements in other countries, et cetera, how could you suggest something that goes beyond Vancouver, BC, so that we're not grabbing what we can here and harming the rest of the world?
Okay, just transitioning global balance, maybe it's a question. And then last one over here.
Thank you for a very quick sprint. Hi. Okay. So my question's around kind of inclusion, but like it's helping the people who the current industry doesn't like help. I speak this as an engineering student, well, like graduate engineering student, but one that is trans and one that is disabled, and is in the is in the process of reconsidering my industry because I cannot find anything. And I know from my experience in my education system that industries don't give a flipping fuck about my lived experience, what I actually value as someone who's disabled and someone who's trans, and like even around gender, like there's this like lip service of like, oh, hire more women, and then there's, on the other hand, there's people who ask me why non-binary people should be considered in gender conversations, and it hurts. So I'm asking you to address how to get people to actually care about lived experience rather than just saying we need to hire more people in this, or just like we need to having the like actually seeing the value in it and not just making lip service, because until we actually like see the value in it, there's not going to be any change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I think, I don't want to say it's exactly the same, but I think there's some questions, some overlap of questions of trauma and of identity. How do those show up? So I'll turn to anyone who wants to take one of those.
First off, thanks for the great questions. Thanks for your vulnerability and sharing that excellent question. It really cuts to the importance of lived experience and within the grand narrative that we're trying to undertake in this work, and to tie back as well to taking a trauma-informed response, and how do we recognize that there's a very human element to these pathways forward to these things we're trying to do. Coming from an industry background that has done a very good job of walling things up behind jargon and walling things up behind like parochial, antiquated knowledge to bleed things of their subjective, qualitative reality, I can speak with a fair bit of authenticity when I say that those sort of pathways disenfranchise people from opportunities. They divest us of our ability to have agency within the things that have pivotal importance to our lives. So it's important to go back to them and to validate them and to ensure that they're key. So in terms of how this might look moving forward, well, when my own people, when we undertake business, when we undertake work, including the solar plant I talked about earlier, we bring ceremony into it. We bring traditional teachings into it. We bring qualitative understandings that have been passed down for innumerable generations. So that way we are identifying with the wisdom of our ancestors, traditional teachings, humanizing every element of business in a way that validates those experiences, validates that ancestral wisdom. So I can see that as a very contemporary thing. You know, for the most part, Indigenous peoples have been kind of cast as being in the past, but we're contemporary. We're just as modern as any other society, just as sovereign as any other society. And so that emphasis on the qualitative relationality of the present time is how we might become more intimately aware of the impact of what we're doing right now, as well as the potential for it to scale out globally, the potential for having an impact beyond our local borders by providing those frameworks, those templates, as you brought up, for how we might relate to one another and talking about it, sharing these stories, sharing how important it is to center people at the heart of this work. And sorry, that was a bit of a diatribe, but I hope it hit well.
I don't think you're going to hear any disagreement in this room that this should be people-centered.
Yeah, I just want to speak to you like a practicality that unions are taking on around inclusion, and inclusion is really critical. I think again for us, solidarity. It's everyone together. Is we're actually getting contract language. That's something that we can do to demonstrate to our union siblings and to workers in general by prioritizing contract language that is inclusive. Right? And we went from winning maternal leave to winning parental leave, right? Understanding that that's not everyone's lived experience. And so we're looking at spaces like washrooms and things like this, where we need to ensure that the spaces, the workspaces where we're doing the work are inclusive, and that we have the language in the contracts to be the foundation for that, right? And education as well. And we have some really great allies in community that help us with that. So it's important to center that. And I think there was a question here. I'm just trying to remember what it was.
I took it to be, how are we working within planetary boundaries, perhaps, as we consider these new, how do we ensure that while we support the human material wealth we all deserve, we don't overshoot the finite resources we have?
Yeah, and I think that's where political will becomes really important, and as individuals and as groups of people, to ensure that the values that we hold are reflected in government, because some of these things, when we're talking globally, ultimately it is going to be government. Although as unions, we belong to international trade federations and there's different bodies around the world where we can be in solidarity with workers from the global south, workers from Asia, that sort of solidarity. But I think we need to look at things like our own government having a temporary foreign worker, where we allow, as a government and a society, those workers who come here to be paid less. We need the political will to reject that and say that if you're a worker here, you're a worker, you get paid what a worker gets paid, and we value the work. And we value all work, right? Because we look at really intensive and emotionally laborsome work like care work, healthcare work, mental health care work. And we're not valuing that. So that's another piece of just transition, is looking at work that we currently do and how we value that, and how we include those workers in this conversation as well, because it's not just about the jobs that we will get to have. My grandmother, for example, was a switchboard operator. You can't operate it. Probably half the people in this room don't know what that is, right? But there are jobs in telecom, and there will continue to be jobs in telecom that won't look like the jobs today. But we need to make sure that we focus on those being good jobs, and that we're not not inviting people here to come and do work and consider them less and erode our own quality of life and not treating them equally.
Maybe I'll just pick up, I'm hearing a theme around humanizing, right? And when our systems don't treat us as valuable, the difference for me is between diversity and inclusion, right? Like, it's not just about making the spaces, but when people arrive, what are they arriving to? How are they being treated, right? From the moment you read a job advertisement, to the language in the contract, to how you gather inside of the workplace, to where the workplace is located, to what the workplace looks like, to what the workplace is built out of, to if you see anyone who looks like you when you get to work. And so I hear in the trauma-informed question, and then also the question about like lived experience, and this is impacting me and my livelihood, that we did a thing. We separated these things that aren't really meant to be separated, and now we're trying to add them in, and we're looking to other worldviews and knowledge systems, and I'm so grateful to my Indigenous colleagues who are helping to show us how we could live in right relation. But the question of the just transition is a question for me about humanizing the economy, and really, it's rocky right now. It's rocky right now.
Yeah, just your question point made me think of, we haven't talked about unjust transitions, which are, I mean, Canada's a landscape of unjust transitions, and in Scotland, where the Just Transition Commission is deeply kind of informed by memories of unjust transitions in the past. So the deindustrialisation, which kind of swept across Scotland, a lot of people lost their jobs without support. And that memory still kind of deeply scars communities around Scotland. So that informs the impulse to do something about it right this time. Yeah, which is important to think about in this context too. Yeah.
If I can try to tie some of those themes together here as we close, I mean, I think Tessa said it really well. Like, this just transition work will not succeed unless it's human in nature. It will not succeed unless it not just pays a little compliment and says, oh yeah, I guess, you know, we all come to this with our positionality and whatever, blah, blah, blah. But it has to be instantiated in law. There have to be rules that ensure and protect people's humanity. And then the harder work will be to change people's hearts. It will be to shift the culture. We need rules that will ensure that there's no backsliding, but at the end of the day, this is something that will be done in hearts and minds, and that will take a long time. The work we found, all the research on the just transition says this is a multi-generational project, as is the transition to net zero. That's not going to happen tomorrow. We are all in this topsy-turvy boat together, but if we do that as humans and not as automatons and technocrats, we can get there. But if we forget that humanity along the way, well, we will not only lose the planet, but we will lose each other. And I can't think of a worse outcome than that. And so the work of, I think, folks like this on the stage here is to bring the technical insights. We could talk to you for 8 hours about all the smart things that these people have and do in their day jobs. But I'm so glad, actually, that the human element of this is really what stood out, because that's certainly how we approach the work at VEC. I know it's how all my colleagues approach their work every day. And I'm so thrilled that we could share a little bit of that humanity with all of you today. So I want to thank the panelists again. Let's give them a big round of applause here. I want to thank UBC and in particular Kate, who has shepherded us through this whole process. We're so grateful to have had this opportunity to share this, not only with this audience, but with all of you across the country. So thank you so much. Merci, and have a wonderful afternoon. We're excited for the next conversations.